It was the story that rocked the country's political world last year. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff gives Mike Duffy $90,000 to settle Duffy's Senate expenses. Stephen Harper said it all happened behind his back and that Nigel Wright was the one most responsible for the deception. But initially, he had praised Wright. Then a few days later, he accepted his resignation, and then a few months after that, said he had fired him. Through it all, the RCMP had to decide whether Wright had broken the law. Today, the Mounties say no charges will be laid against Wright. So what now? Andrew's here in Toronto, Chantal is in Montreal, and Bruce is in Calgary. I guess if you have charges hanging over your head for months, almost a year in Nigel Wright's case, you must feel pretty good the day they say they're not going to be charging you. What's your general sense of what happened today, Andrew? You start us.
Well, beyond that, as you say, that sense of relief for him personally, I guess the immediate thing is the fact that they didn't lay criminal charges doesn't mean that nothing happened here or that it wasn't wrong. The facts of this are not hugely in dispute. The payment was made. It was made in secret. It was made in exchange for conditions including the silence of Mr. Duffy about his false expense claims. And beyond, of course, the immediate issue of the payment, there's the whole business of tampering with an audit, of manipulating a Senate committee, and the whole question of who knew what when all about this. I think a lot of Canadians will be puzzled and will be scratching their heads as to how it could be legal to make essentially, to pay hush money to a sitting legislator, how that could be lawful. And all we can say is that having made an exhaustive investigation, as one must assume, the RCMP does not feel that the evidence supports laying charges.
Chantal?
But just because it's not criminal or illegal does not make it right. If the criminal code was the code of ethics of the House of Commons, we wouldn't have a code of ethics. Anything that is within the bounds of the law would be okay, and we know that that is not the case. So yes, I think this is better news for the Prime Minister, the PMO, and obviously Nigel Wright than the alternative. But it doesn't make it go away, the notion that what took place in the PMO was so close to the line that the RCMP had to spend almost a year to decide that it was not going to lay charges.
Bruce, what do you make of it all?
Well, it's good news, obviously, for Nigel Wright. I think it's also good news for Canadians, Peter. The fact that the Prime Minister's top aide was not charged with a criminal act, I think that's good news for everybody. It's a chapter in a story. It's not exactly an unexpected plot twist, and it's certainly not the final chapter. This story is going to continue for some considerable period of time. Mr. Wright said a couple of things today. One was that all of his actions he thought were in the public interest and they were lawful. I think that obviously the police agreed with him that they were lawful. But his statement that they were in the public interest, he may be the only person who believes that. I certainly think you could make the case that had he chosen to say no to Mr. Duffy, not to give him that money, that would have at least been more in the public interest than the action that he did take. Having said that, I think that there were more things unanswered today than were answered, including the nature of the comment from the PMO, which was really quite guarded. It was almost as though, yes, he's cooperated with the police, and we're cooperating with the police too. There was no triumphalism there, no praise for Mr. Wright.
I should make a couple of clarifications for those who may have missed the top of the broadcast. Nigel Wright didn't personally come in front of the cameras and stand in front of a microphone and make those statements that Bruce just mentioned. They were in a written statement put out by his law firm. In fact, Nigel Wright has not appeared in front of a camera to talk, with a couple of exceptions of saying, I'm not going to talk right now, at all throughout this whole situation. He may or may not give an interview at some point, but the process isn't over. It's clear that the Mounties may call, if somebody is charged with something, they may call Nigel Wright as a witness. What, aside from those general reflections, did we learn? What questions were answered about Nigel Wright today, Chantal?
Possibly that the RCMP, and when you looked at the affidavit they filed in court to pursue their inquiries, it certainly read like that the RCMP came to the conclusion that if there was a perpetrator of anything in this saga, the active one was possibly not Nigel Wright, but possibly Mike Duffy. And that the fact that he is said to still be cooperating with the RCMP and could be asked to testify at some point suggests that the file itself is not closed. So we did find that out today.
Bruce?
Well, I guess I'm struck by the fact that we need to be really careful about how we handle these statements that come from the police now. Obviously, we've been through a process where the police released information about what their hypotheses were, and that created an awful lot of political reaction. Now, I think if we try to overparse the limited information that they put out, we're going to find ourselves in some difficulty. I did, for my part anyway, look at the statement that they issued and say, okay, they've concluded that Mr. Wright didn't commit a crime. But by alluding to the fact that there might need to be witnesses, or he might need to be a witness, they left open the question of whether they thought there still was a crime. Having said that, I really do think we have to be very careful not to overanalyze limited statements from the police in the course of an ongoing investigation. All right,
I think that's good advice. Having said that, what questions remain unanswered for everyone? Andrew?
A whole host of them, particularly, I mean, the specific questions about Nigel Wright, I think the most important one is, why did he do it? This is a guy who was known throughout his career up to this point as being not only a person of good ethics, but good judgment. And on neither score did making a secret payment to a sitting legislator to keep him silent, would that add up to either of those. So I think that's remained a question in the background of all this, is why not only was Nigel Wright so keen to keep him quiet, but why were all these other people, senior people in the Conservative Party, senior officials around the Prime Minister, devoting large amounts of time, as we've learned through those emails they were all exchanging with each other, to the conundrum of keeping Mike Duffy, quote unquote, whole? Why didn't they just say to him, pay back the expenses, and if you don't, you can sit with some other caucus? They seemed awfully keen, for reasons that nobody at this point can judge, to keep him on side, and that remains, I think, the biggest overarching question of the whole affair, on top of which, of course, is the question of what did the Prime Minister know and when did he know it, as everyone likes to say, and his own answers on that have been so unclear.
I think that's the biggest gray area, the latter, because in all those emails, the clear impression from Nigel Wright's writing is that the Prime Minister was in the loop of this before it was finalized. Now, with the police investigation finished, unless Nigel Wright gives interviews to try to explain this, and I'm not sure that he will, that gray area will remain of what the Prime Minister knew and when. And I think for Canadians, what is of more interest, beyond all these people who had this omerta rule that they seem to respect, is, did the Prime Minister give his blessing to that, or did he not? And if he did, as some of those emails suggested, did he lie to the House of Commons when he said he didn't know?
Let me just refresh everyone's memory on some of the things that Stephen Harper said in the last year, really in a kind of a critical 4 or 5 month period of last year, about Nigel Wright. It's interesting to look at them back again as they change in nature. Chris touched a little bit on this in his report, but watch this.
Mr. Wright gave Mr. Duffy money so that what he felt that the right thing should be done, that Mr. Duffy should repay the money he owes taxpayers.
Mr. Wright believed, as we all believe, that the taxpayers of Canada should be reimbursed for the inappropriate expenses. He, Mr. Speaker, decided to do that on his own without informing us. For that reason, upon reflection, I accepted his resignation. On our side, there is one person responsible for this deception, and that person is Mr. Wright. It is Mr. Wright by his own admission. For that reason, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Wright no longer works for us. Mr. Duffy shouldn't either. This is completely unacceptable for me and for the public to be misled in this way. That is why Mr. Wright no longer works here and why Mr. Duffy should not be on the public payroll and the Senate should take action.
So it's pretty clear in tone and words how the Prime Minister's view of Mr. Wright changed through a number of months last year. Bruce, have the stakes changed at all for Stephen Harper after today?
Well, it changed a little bit. I think on one level you could make the case that there's a little bit less pressure on him, but I remain convinced that the bigger issues for him around this question have been the political issues rather than the legal issues. And in that sense, no, I don't think they have. What you just showed was really a series of strategies that had been deployed to manage what was obviously a pretty ugly issue. If they weren't a series of strategies, they were a series of mishaps, a series of terrible political mistakes. I happen to think they were a series of strategies, which really goes to the point that was made earlier, that there's something underneath the hood of this whole mess that the Prime Minister still doesn't want to see come to light. And the truth is that even though we've got this limited bit of information from the police today, it remains the case that I know Conservative partisans think there's been a lot of disclosure, but I think the average voter might look at this situation and say, why don't some of these people step in front of a camera at length and talk about what exactly happened? That still isn't going on.
You want to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the shifting stories that we've heard from the Prime Minister, it's the things he hasn't said. He's been asked probably hundreds of questions by Tom Mulcair in Parliament, many of them just straightforward, factual questions. And, you know, there's an old saying, the great thing about telling the truth is it's easy to keep your story straight. If there was no story here, if there was nothing he had to worry about, you'd think he'd be full and frank in answering all those questions, because he wouldn't have to worry about whether answer A accorded with answer B. Of course they would. So the fact that he has not answered these questions is highly disturbing. Bruce mentioned the legal and the political. They kind of intersect, though, of course, because if Mr. Duffy faces charges, and I say if, and if Mr. Wright is called as a witness, then we're going to presumably hear much more than we've heard from, certainly from Nigel Wright, about all this, and it will confirm one way or another, one supposes, about what conversations he had with the Prime Minister or didn't.
All right, you've touched on Mike Duffy, and it's the one person we haven't really talked about in this conversation tonight. And I wonder if you're Mike Duffy and you're watching what unfolded today unfold, how do you feel about that? I mean, Nigel Wright isn't going to get charged about giving him a check. Does that mean this is good news for Mike Duffy?
No, I think it means that he's on his own, and he now stands apart from the government in more ways than one, because he is not off the hook, but he has been severed from the political case involving the government, and his entire case in the Senate was that, you know, he was led on to this wrongdoing. He was almost taken for a ride into impropriety. I think the police conclusions do not suggest that he was led on.
Bruce?
Well, I think today is cold, if any comfort for Mr. Duffy. I think the police, alluding to the idea that Mr. Wright would be more appropriate as a witness rather than as a suspect, suggests that they continue to believe that there's some criminal act that may have occurred here. Not that they've concluded that one did, but certainly that they haven't ruled that out. And that's got to be a source of ongoing concern for Mr. Duffy.
The other person, of course, is Pamela Wallin, not involved in any fashion in the whole Wright-Duffy aspect of this story, but involved in the greater Senate scandal story. Anything for her in this today, Andrew?
I can't see anything immediately, no. I mean, the intersection that we know about is between Nigel Wright and Mike Duffy, the complicated you know, negotiations that went into that payment. He certainly did not pay her expenses, so I don't think this has any particular implications for her that I can think of. But certainly it must be ominous for Mike Duffy, both that they did not clear him today and that Nigel Wright is said to be cooperating with the police fully.
I guess the only reason I raised it, because of that sense that Wright may be called on a stand at some point somewhere as a witness. The Wallin case hasn't been resolved. They're still looking at that. The Duffy case hasn't been resolved, and other ones that we're aware of. And you know, may well have been a relationship between Wallin and the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister on her issues as well. So you never know whether that's in there as well.
None that we know of, I think, I would say at this point.
Exactly. All right, I think perhaps the best way to have captured it is what Bruce kind of said. This is another chapter in the story. It's not the final chapter. There's more to come even after it's been kind of silent for the last few. All right, thank you all. The Tuesday night at issue. Andrew here in Toronto, Chantal in Montreal, Bruce in Calgary tonight.